All right, so we are going to be going over somebody saying insulin and aging. Do carbs make you age faster? And his name is Simland. So not too sure how much he knows in terms of the whole reactive oxygen species, inflammation, and what are the literal primary causes of aging. Once again, being chronic inflammation and reactive oxygen species. But we'll see what he has to say because I'm sort of curious if he knows.
Some longevity gurus even say that every single time you raise your insulin levels, you're aging much faster, and the key to living longer and slowing down aging is to keep your insulin levels as low as possible. Is it true? Well, in this video I'm going to talk about the effects of insulin and the role of insulin in aging, and whether or not eating more carbohydrates or raising insulin levels is associated with accelerated aging and shorter lifespans.
He says associated already. So I don't really like the fact that he's talking about association studies because, in my opinion, the best way to tell is just using biochemistry. Because if we use biochemistry, we can pretty much like rule out 90% of things most of the time being correct or incorrect, or 80%, because sometimes, once again, even in biochemistry, data is falsified. But in association studies, it's like 80 to 90% of data is falsified. If you're interested, you can go check out my Science is Fake video to see why I say that.
Do it! Let's start with some of the fundamental roles and evolutionarily conserved mechanisms of insulin on aging and longevity. The insulin and insulin-like growth factor IGF-1 signaling, or IIS pathway, which connects insulin with insulin-like growth factor 1, is actually one of the more oldest and one of the most conserved evolutionary pathways that is associated with longevity and the speed of which the organism ages and lives. Insulin and IGF-1 both connect with the mechanistic target of rapamycin, or mTOR, which is a growth pathway in the body that promotes cellular replication, senescence, and just in excess, it is associated with aging. That's pretty...
Okay, so the reason he's saying this is because this is actually contributed by leucine, pretty much. This is like the main thing that actually causes mTOR pathway to be activated. So yeah, just to let you know, IGF, once again, IGF is also one. Insulin. If you really want to lower that, once again, all it really comes down to is just choosing glucagon over insulin. And we already know the way that you choose glucagon over insulin is by choosing fatty acid, which is, for that matter, what most animals in the animal kingdom use as an energy source. They use fatty acid. Herbivores and carnivores alike, they both use the same thing. They aren't using glucose. So just to recap real quick. And by the way, glucose means carbohydrates. Carbohydrates and glucose are pretty much like the same thing, just to let you know.
Senescence, and just in excess, it is associated with aging. That's pretty evident by now. Things that raise mTOR are proteins and amino acids, but through the insulin and IGF-1 pathways, carbohydrates can also activate the mTOR pathway, which in theory, at least in mechanistically, has been found to shorten lifespans of model organisms like different kinds of yeast, fruit flies, and rodents. There's no clear evidence to suggest that mTOR expression would accelerate aging or shorten lifespan in humans, but it is plausible that excess mTOR activation or this dysfunctional chronic mTOR activation may promote the growth of some malignancies or tumors. In these fruit flies, mutations in the Chico pathway, which is kind of the analogous to the insulin pathway in humans, they found that the median lifespan can now be up to 48% longer. And in C. elegans, or roundworms, pretty much insulin blocks some of the longevity promoting factors like SKN1. The mice who lack...
Well, the main reason why insulin lowers lifespan, I would say, and this just comes down to reactive oxygen species. Works is, whenever you're going through glucose oxidation, instead of beta oxidation, there's two kinds. The beta oxidation is where you use fatty acid as fuel, and glucose oxidation is where you use glucose as fuel. What happens is 10 NADH are made and 2 FADH2 are made every single time you go through glucose oxidation. And when you go through beta oxidation, it's about 31 NADH to 15 FADH2. Now, FADH and NADH are basically just the electron carriers that go to oxidative phosphorylation. Either they go to complex 1, in this case NADH goes to complex 1 and FADH2 goes to complex 2. Now the thing is, when it comes to that specifically, that is from my understanding, that's pretty much the main cause of aging. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's because of insulin. Like, yes, insulin is associated with it because you're eating carbohydrates. And the reason this happens is because when you go through complex 1 more, and when more NADH is made, we already know complex 1 is more prone to electron leakage. And because complex 1 is more prone to electron leakage, more reactive oxygen species are made. Specifically, more superoxides are made, and then the superoxide will turn into a hydrogen peroxide, and then the hydrogen peroxide will turn into a hydroxyl free radical. So that's basically how it works. And the reason that hydroxyl free radical is a really big deal is because it'll cause oxidative stress and lipid peroxidation. It basically just damages the cell. The inflammation can do the same thing, chronic inflammation. Now, you can get chronic inflammation multiple ways. You can get it, one, through phytotoxins, which are plants and vegetables, basically. Or you can get it the second way, which is necrosis of the cell, and basically, or pyroptosis of the cell, I guess. As long as you release caspases into the extracellular environment, then that's pretty much what happens. So caspases are basically the trigger to your body's immune system that it looks like somebody just recently died, like right outside of your window, for instance. And it's like a complete panic signal. And the reason is because that exact same signal of caspases being released is exactly what viruses do. Viruses will lyse the cell, or most of them anyways. Most viruses will lyse the cell, and when they lyse the cell bursts open. Tons of viruses start basically proliferating, and they just keep on repeating that process. And lo and behold, in the process, caspases are released, and when your immune system detects those caspases, it freaks out, it like panics, and in fact, even your regular cells panic, and they go through pyroptosis, and they freak out, and they try to figure out like what's going on here, and inflammation is caused. And in that case, that is damaging. Those are the two primary causes of aging, because those cause every single one of these problems. Now, the reason I don't necessarily know if he's going to talk about this, but that is the reason why insulin is associated with this. It's not because of mTOR. From my understanding, mTOR can play a role, but it's much more from a fact of chronic inflammation and reactive oxygen species, because there are 9 primary hallmarks in aging, and those two are pretty much like the biggest contributors to every single one of them. So, yeah.
The insulin receptor in the adipose tissue, they have about 18% longer lifespan on average.
Cool.
And interestingly enough, in humans who have these mutations in the insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor, they apparently also live slightly longer, so the centenarians. However, when you look at some actual association studies in humans, then they do actually find that the low levels of IGF-1 are also associated with increased mortality, and the same applies to too high IGF-1 levels, trials say. So first off, diabetes is clearly associated with accelerated aging.
Okay, yeah, once again, this is an association thing. Like, obviously it's going to be associated with aging. You're producing more reactive oxygen species. This is bound to happen. More reactive oxygen species means you need more antioxidants. And not only do you need more antioxidants, you're going to cause more damage to your cells. You're producing more oxidative stress for your cells and more lipid peroxidation, and in this case more inflammation, because if it if it damages the cell membrane in this case and lyses it, then lo and behold, you got a problem, because now you got necrosis, and that just releases caspases, and like I said before, that leads to problems. So yeah, this is like association stuff. I'm not really that big of a fan of this stuff. Definitely not, but this is sort of obvious.
And shorter lifespans, people who have diabetes can live up to 13 years or 14 years shorter than people who don't have diabetes. There's many reasons why people get diabetes, but the root cause or the root mechanism and physiology of diabetes is insulin resistance and improper glucose tolerance. There are many things that
Let's see if he knows.
Contribute to that glucose intolerance and insulin resistance. You can get diabetes by eating too much sugar, you can get diabetes by just hyperinsulinemia, and you can also get diabetes by eating too much fat and just too much calories in general.
No, you can't get it from too much fat. Or at least if you're eating regularly, like, you're not gonna have this problem. No. So this fat will stimulate glucagon. Fat will not stimulate insulin. And this insulin resistance comes from insulin being chronically elevated. That is the whole problem with diabetes. It's being chronically elevated, and suddenly the cells start developing insulin resistance. This does not come from fat. This comes strictly from carbohydrates, not from fat, once again. So, no. If you mix the fat with carbohydrates, then I'll say yes. But otherwise, no. It's definitely not going to be the fat that's causing this. No.
Eating excess carbohydrates and being insulin resistant probably also contributes to the increased death from diabetes and incident.
Yeah, okay. He doesn't really seem to know the biochemistry, from what I'm understanding. Diabetes was a cracked case a long time ago. There's a lot of people who figured this out already. It literally is just chronically elevated insulin. And the way you deal with that chronically elevated insulin is by getting rid of carbohydrates. I mean, the best, even if you want to play the epidemiology game, which I really don't like playing, but if you want to play the epidemiology game when it comes to studies, you put people on a carnivore diet, not even a full carnivore diet, and there was 2,000 people in the study, the Harvard study, 99% of them quit their type 2 diabetes medication, and they didn't need it anymore. In that study, 99%. That's a carnivore diet, meaning they're eating a lot of fat. So fat is not the contributor to diabetes. Once again, this is you just learn biochemistry. You learn biochemistry, and it'll solve itself pretty quickly. You'll know the answer.
Resistance or cardiovascular disease that you get, but there are also other studies that find a lower carbohydrate intake is associated with increased mortality. So this.
Okay, yeah. Once again, this is like, oh boy. Just give me biochemistry, man. Don't give me epidemiology, because once again, epidemiology studies, the reason why it's so difficult to get anything out of them is because in an epidemiology study, unless you're very well controlling for variables, you're not going to find much, because it's most epidemiology studies, or a lot of them that I'm aware of, are definitely bought out. Like 90% of them. For instance, just to give you an example of how bad it is, when it comes to psychology studies, like 86% of them were basically useless and not relevant. And it actually, I would probably even argue 90%, because I'm pretty sure some of them got lucky enough to dodge it. If you're really interested, once again, my Science is Fake video will explain that. But this is like, when it comes to biochemistry, just understand the biochemistry, and this doesn't make sense. You'll learn really quickly, this is exactly why adding carbohydrates causes all these problems. It's not just because of insulin. It's also because carbohydrates, some of them, for instance, contain fructose, and fructose will lead to a really, really quick glycation, and then you have more advanced glycation end products, which is part of literally Alzheimer's in the first place as one of the problems. It's a whole lot more problems than that. It could also be fatty liver as well, which is basically just extra lipid droplets on your liver. That's not good, because you end up getting bilirubin being formed, because bilirubin is basically jaundice in your jaundice. Jaundice is yellowness in your skin or your eyes. That's a no bueno. You don't want.
The countries with the highest life expectancy in the world follow a relatively higher carb intake. Hong Kong, Japan, Macau. These are.
No. Hong Kong does not follow a high carb intake. Hong Kong follows by the way, the highest country right here, follows a predominantly pork. They eat a lot of meat. Hong Kong eats tons of meat. And you might say, why is that a big deal? Because if we look at what meat has in it in comparison to a lot of these other things, plants, for instance, just remove phytotoxins and immediately you're reducing chronic inflammation, which is already a really big start. Not only that, it's not just chronic inflammation. I mean, there are so many other things. Really give a quick look at that again, because this is not high carb. This is very, very high meat. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, around, I think it was India, for instance, which is all the way down, one of the worst. It's not just poverty that makes India's life expectancy so low. It's the fact that they're eating plants, and primarily plants. And if you know what plants do, once again, that's chronic inflammation and that's glucose oxidation. Two things that you don't want. because both of those lead to, in the end, increased aging. Once again, so this is sort of, I already know this, but he might not know this. I'm not too sure.
Are all South Asian and East Asian countries that eat a lot of rice, and they have relatively higher carb intake compared to some other countries in the world. So
no. Once again, it's pork. It's pork. Hong Kong is pork. Tons and tons and tons of pork. Japan, Okinawa, that supposed blue zone, by the way, eating plants. They're not eating plants. Pork is their staple and their main food. If you go there, literally go there, you will see pork is like Spam specifically is the thing there. It is the bomb. So once again, this is like he doesn't really seem to know that.
So the total amount of carbohydrates isn't that important as the individual who's practicing it and what's the actual metabolic outcomes, in my opinion.
No. It does. Once again, it's all about glucose oxidation. Are you going through fatty acid or are you going through glucose oxidation? Because that's something you can't prevent that from happening. You need ATP. So you're going to get ATP from one way or the other, and you're producing tons and tons and tons of ATP. And if you're going through glucose oxidation over and over again to produce all of those tons and tons and tons of ATP, you better believe you're going to age quicker. Of course you're going to age quicker. This is a no-brainer. In fact, if you really... Oh, man, I don't really like using anecdotal evidence that much, but if you really want to see examples of increased aging very, very quickly, just look at my... basically looking at vegans video and the problem with being vegan. You age so quickly, and the reason you age so quickly is because you're exposing yourself to tons of phytotoxins and you're exposing yourself to tons of glucose oxidation. That's assuming the phytotoxins problem is sort of genetic because some people react much more heavily to it, some people don't, but the glucose oxidation one, that one you cannot prevent. You can't prevent that one. You're not stimulating glucagon when you're eating plants. You're stimulating insulin. Fruits, vegetables, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what it is. You stimulate insulin. And insulin, once again, more reactive oxygen species because complex 1 is more prone to electron leakage. So it's you could just see that video. If you look at that video and you literally see the before and after, there's a guy who quite literally does it for us, and he basically documents tons of these people. And you could just see a before and after. You see dark circles instantly under their eyes within like years, or just being vegan. It's tons and tons of problems end up happening. And it's not just because of malnourishment. It's because, once again, glucose oxidation. That's a really big deal. And phytotoxin, inflammatory, chronic inflammation, which leads to aging. So.
And this 2023, and they found that a certain percentage of macronutrients was associated with a lower risk of mortality. A high-calorie diet composed of moderately high protein, 20%, moderate fat, 30%, and moderate carbohydrate, 50%, was associated.
Once again, this is epidemiology. Like, you're not going to get anything out of this. Asking somebody a questionnaire is definitely not going to work. And unless you're literally controlling for what they are eating, you're not going to get accurate results. First, you have to know the biochemistry. And then once you know the biochemistry, you have to actually implement it into real life, which is, by the way, very difficult because in a actual randomized controlled trial of humans, you're not going to lock a human up in a laboratory and say, okay, eat this. Like, that's not happening. That's why the Harvard study itself, the Harvard carnivore study itself is not perfect. Because if you look at what they're eating, they're still adding in like spices. Some people have extra beans if they want to. It's not really full carnivore. But the whole point is it's more meat. And more meat, once again, that's more glucagon. And the less you're eating insulin, the less you're eating carbohydrate, and the more you're stimulating glucagon by basically eating fat and meat, you will guaranteed not just lose weight, you will go through beta oxidation as well, less reactive oxygen species being formed. You're also exposing yourself to less phytotoxins, meaning, once again, less chronic inflammation. And those are main things that contribute to aging. Literally, that's what it is. That's primarily it. If you somehow make complex 1 less prone to reactive oxygen species generation, then yeah, I would probably say that human will live much longer. even eating glucose. Although they do still have problems with deuterium because deuterium will mess with ATP synthase. But that's they're probably going to live much longer if that's the case. They would live like 10 times longer if they go meat as well. But regardless, it's the same thing. So.
In conclusion, in animal studies, in model organisms, excess insulin and IGF-1 levels mechanistically are associated with aging and shorter lifespans. But
duh. Mechanistically, of course they're going to be.
In humans, there doesn't appear to be any direct evidence.
No, there is direct evidence. Once again, there's obvious evidence. There's obvious evidence. The only problem is everybody eats carbohydrates. So what's your control group? What's your control group supposed to be if every single person is constantly eating carbohydrates? You don't have a control group. So what are you measuring against? You have nothing to measure it against. Once again, you have to, the only way that you're going to get a genuinely decently accurate study in terms of like human lifespan and all this stuff and aging is you have to start a kid, a baby on carnivore, and you have a baby on vegan, and you basically just compare them from start to finish. That is the only way that it's going to work. And I mean, somebody might be doing that study for right now for that matter. In fact, if there is somebody out there who's listening to this and who's a scientist, go do that study, because I guarantee you that study is going to be a hit. And that study might get you into some trouble because there's actually a lot of money on the plant-based side, just to let you know. So yeah, be careful. So I hope you learned something in terms of how exactly aging is caused, more specifically from a mechanistic standpoint and not just constant epidemiology studies, because they're not really accurate. Number one, you can't really discern much. Their variables are thrown all over the place. We have mechanistic models are the best possible thing that we can use. Whenever it comes to hard science, if you are doing biology, hardcore biology, not epidemiology, hardcore biology, hardcore chemistry, or hardcore physics, those three things are much harder to p-hack for. It's very difficult to falsify your data. You can falsify your data, there's no question. I mean, even in particle physics, it has been done, even with such ridiculously low p-values like 5 sigma, but regardless, it still applies. The whole point is carbohydrates will increase aging. All you need to do is you need to understand the mechanistic approach of it. And when you understand the mechanistic approach of it, you can even apply it to real life and you will see the answers yourself. Hong Kong. Is Hong Kong living longer or shorter than India? Obviously longer. Why is that? Hong Kong is highest meat consumption. And what is India? India's lowest meat consumption. Even if you account for poverty, India still ends up going from 67 years of age average to 75, which is not, or actually 74 or 73. It's a 7-year increase. Assuming that you eradicate all poverty, it's still not even, it's like 73 or something, 74. So that's not even close to Hong Kong. Once again, Hong Kong is 85. So hopefully this explains why exactly aging occurs in the first place, and you understand this from a mechanistic perspective, because it's not just this mTOR and IGF stuff. No, it's associated with it because it stimulates reactive oxygen species, because you're going through glucose oxidation. And once again, it all comes down to reactive oxygen species and chronic inflammation. Those are the two primary factors that cause aging. They cause every single hallmark of aging that I can think of, literally all 9 of them. So yeah, thanks again for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope you learned a little bit about the mechanistic stuff. Now, if you're really interested in all the science behind this, then I recommend you go check out my Science Behind Carnivore playlist, because it explains all of this in way more detail, and it explains how exactly all of this functions. And once again, if you want to see all my videos ahead of time, click the join button down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next one. Peace.